Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Jared and Michael wanted me to tell you that this is a special bonus episode. If you're a normal person who likes bonuses, then don't forget to push that subscribe button and join us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future bonus content. You can also become a member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers, where you can get access to our blog and learn more about the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. I'm your host, Thomas J. Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Michael Granado.
MG in the house.
And Raymond Perrier.
What's up?
All right. So today we are doing part 2 of our pre-debate discussion regarding Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek. Last time we gave kind of an overview of psychoanalysis, the distinctions between Lacanian psychoanalysis and Jungian psychoanalysis vis-a-vis Jordan Peterson and Slavoj. This time, since we didn't really talk that much about Žižek's positions, especially his political positions, I thought we would spend a little bit more time talking about the distinctions between capitalism and communism and try to flesh out these arguments as best we can. So, without further ado, Mike, you want to get us started talking about capitalism, what that means and what it means culturally and economically?
I approach both capitalism and Marxism, I would approach through more of a historical lens than a philosophical lens. And I think historically, one of the things that we have to recognize is that both of these systems, both of these economic systems, and even economics itself, is relatively new. All of which I think traces its origins back to the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution, without a doubt, probably the most important thing to ever happen in history in terms of the impact on our day-to-day life, in terms of how it's affected society, economy, culture, all of that. So if you're interested in understanding like what economics is, what modern economics is, what modern capitalism is, I mean, I think you have to go back to industrialization. Starting in the 18th century, the traditional start date being 1750, starting in the British Empire. And with the Industrial Revolution, you have the emergence of modern economy, modern consumer-based economy, an economy centered around the buying and selling of goods being everything from traditional textiles to food, eventually to services, stuff like that. So if you're talking about capitalism, if you're talking about Adam Smith writing a little bit before industrialization proper, but nevertheless, Adam Smith being witness to the changing economy, the kind of shift from economies centered around hand production, economies in which people, like back in the day, if you wanted a pair of clothes, you had to make it, or you had to get grandma to make it, right? Grandma would sit there with her like arthritis-laden fingers and spend, a couple of months making you a shirt or something, right?
Or you could go to Artisan as well, but you didn't have mass
grandma.
production.
You had to get grandma with her arthritis, right? But yeah, so the big thing about industrialization is you have this big shift from handmade production to machine-based production. And with machine-based production, industrialization creates this kind of like domino effect that just happens throughout. It begins in Britain, like I said, quickly spreads to Europe, then to America, then to the rest of the world. And so you have the shift from hand-based production to machine-based production. You get the rise of the factory system. You get the beginning of currency-based economies, really of wages, of hourly pay. Everything that we're familiar with begins with this. And it also begins the idea of capitalism or a consumer-based society in which goods and services are purchased with a particular nation's cash or currency, and that people are paid X amount of dollars per hour to do whatever work. So this is mid 18th century. What starts to happen by the 19th century is that people start to problematize, start to bring up issues associated with this capitalist-based economy, with these capitalist-based economies. And historically speaking, probably the biggest critic, the most well-known critic of capitalism being Karl Marx. What Marx was pointing at, what Marx was upset with when he visited England, was the plight of the working people, the people that were working in the coal mines, the people that were working in the factories, the women, the children, the men who are working these 12, 14 hours a day shift. Back then, there's no such thing as workman's comp. There's no such thing as like health insurance. If you got injured on the job, that was it. So Marx looks at the situation of the worker, of the common everyday worker, and he starts to call attention to some of these basic issues. And so Marx and Marxism represents first, not the first, but probably the biggest objection to this system of factory-based wage labor that we call modern capitalism. Now,
Mike,
we
let
want to
me let
go
me
ahead.
tap in here too, because I wanna ask you in terms of, or I guess point out two things. So one of the things is that when you think of capitalism, largely in our country, everybody associates it with being American, right?
Yeah.
And so historically, there's also been the social and political realities of frontier America and its association with capitalism, which is a very different kind of association to capitalism that Europe and England had, where, Karl
Hmm.
Marx and all these people were there to critique. And I just say that because I think that a lot of historians who study economy, who study economics, I think will kind of try to play that distinction that,
Yeah.
the frontier economy of America is really what defines, I think, probably the way that we understand capitalism as sort of the idea of self interest and the well being of other people being hand in hand. So much so that, there's that famous line from, The Wealth of Nations that, what's it, the butcher and the brewer, we can expect our dinner from them out of regard for their own interests, but it's not, regard for others per se. And there's sort of this idea that self interest can be valuable to other people.
Right.
And I think that that's especially applicable to like frontier society,
Yeah.
and a little different than when you think of the monarchical societies of like Europe and England, uh, which is I think also perhaps why things like Marxism even developed there and never developed here.
No, I think that's an absolutely fantastic point. In fact, I mean, if we're talking about purely from a historical basis, I mean, there's a lot of depth you can go into with this. If you're interested, look it up. But there's different stages of the Industrial Revolution. You have the first Industrial Revolution, the second, and the third. America doesn't enter the Industrial Revolution until the 19th century, and the Industrial Revolution that happens in America is really distinct from what happens in Europe, so much so that some historians will refer to it as the market revolution. It just happens differently. It occurs differently. So yeah, what Raymond was saying is absolutely right. A major distinction between the United States of America in the 19th century and these other European nations is America, 19th century, early 19th century, most of the population is centered late 18th century, early 19th century, most of the population centered on the eastern coast. And you have this monumentous event in American history where you have this population shift, where people start moving west with the expansion westward of the country, opens up new opportunities. And I think, Raymond, I think you're absolutely right. This sort of frontier spirit, this American spirit that comes to define the American spirit, American dream, whatever, is kind of intimately tied with these capitalistic assumptions, right? Your fortune, your wealth is waiting for you out there. Go claim it.
Yeah, and I don't want to take us too far off the cuff with it, but the only reason I brought that up is because I think that there's going to be an argument that comes up, I would imagine, between Žižek and Peterson, and on the part of Žižek that perhaps he might bring this up. I know he's referenced it in a few of his books before, but just the idea that without frontier, can capitalism, remain the way that it originally was instantiated in places like America? I think that that's debatable. I think that it's you have to ask the question as to whether or not it needs to be transformed into some other kind of economic system or take on a different, shape altogether. And I think that that'll hopefully they'll talk some about that. That would be interesting.
That would be. Jared, you about to
Yeah, what are
say
you gonna say,
something?
Jared?
Oh, I don't know at this point. Well, going back, since we're looking at kind of historical foundations here, I think we can also, I mean, capitalism as such, I think really does get kicked off with the Industrial Revolution, but I think some of the, if not philosophical, at least some of the early tinges of what eventually becomes economics. I mean, you can trace back to the late Renaissance with someone like Luca Pacioli. So, like Luca
Yeah.
Pacioli invents double entry bookkeeping, which allows for the possibility of thinking of modern economics in a new way. Because what you have before is, I mean, you've always had markets, right?
Yeah.
But the flows of economies was always something mysterious, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that somewhat changes with Luca Pacioli, because when you have double entry bookkeeping, what you have the costs associated with running a business, and then you have surplus value. And the surplus value is capital. And what you can do with surplus value is see what your investments look like, right? So if you know it costs X amount of dollars to run a business, and you have so much surplus value, then you can take a percentage of that surplus value and then you can put it towards investments. And that changes the dynamics. It takes the economic situation kind of out of the realms of fate,
Yeah.
out of the hands of God, and it puts it into the hands of the economists.
Yeah,
I think that another feature which commonly gets spoken of, economics and sociology are not my bread and butter, so
They're none of ours, I don't think.
yeah. I don't know how much of this is old hat, but there's a common trope in terms of discussions of the birth of capitalism, in terms of Max Weber, right?
Yeah.
The spirit of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and basically that the earliest experiments in something like mercantile capitalism prior to the real industrial revolution is you have like the Dutch republics, right? And that a lot of this is born out of some metaphysical assumptions, which puts us back kind of in our wheelhouse. So, what is the Protestant spirit, and how does that function within economics? Is this something you guys want me to speak to really quickly, or
Yeah.
do you want to just?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we have to kind of go way back to talk about one of the second generation Protestant reformers, John Calvin, who was instrumental in kind of Presbyterianism, or what became Presbyterianism, or just Calvinism more generally. And there was a problem with the kind of pulling away from the Catholic Church during the late Renaissance. So the Catholic Church had always kind of provided the structural beliefs for the people of Europe, that there was a definite way of trying to figure out where you fit in the cosmos. Well, after the Reformation, and especially with Luther's idea that salvation comes from individual faith, right? Then you don't have a structure, a remedy, a formula for how one guarantees your own salvation. So the fear of, hellfire, like how do I know whether or not I've been redeemed? This becomes a real problem for early Protestants. And Calvin kind of comes to the rescue with regards to this, with his notion of this deterministic view of predestination that says that God, in his infinite wisdom, before the foundations of the world, decided who was going to be members of the elect, that is, who was going to get into heaven, and who was going to be members of the reprobate, who had been predetermined to go to hell. And this had this odd benefit. The benefit is that if you were kind of a productive member of society, like you couldn't know whether or not you were going to hell.
Let me just, super quick. I just want to say, if you're interested in that sort of like theological bent, you can check out our episode on free will and determinism. We kind of go into more depth there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that the thing about Calvinism is you don't know whether or not you're a member of the elect, but Calvin, or at least Calvinists, reasoned that if you were a productive member of society, then it stood to be more reasonable, I suspect, that you were a member of the elect and not the reprobate, right? So if you were kind of the town drunk, it was more evidence that you were possibly not, predetermined to go to heaven. This had this weird effect on society, which was in cultures where Calvinism was really important. You had this industrious spirit where people they imbued their work with this theological emphasis, right? Such that this work ethic was to be praised. Now, this is important, I think, for a couple of reasons. Not least of all because in the medieval period, in a Catholic society, if you had people that were not productive members of society for various reasons, you had beggars, for example, they weren't treated with contempt. They were kind of treated with pity, right? That you were supposed to give alms to the beggars because that was your Christian duty. But in a Calvinist society, people who were not productive members of society were seen as kind of a reprobate. So that means where I think this becomes important is in this moral valuation of work, which you get in capitalism, right? In capitalist societies, which have been influenced especially by Calvinism, what I think that you get is a real moral contempt for people who are not seen as productive members of society.
Yeah. And I think most people would be familiar with this sort of moral assumption that people who are wealthy have worked hard for their wealth, they've earned their wealth. Whereas, on the other hand, the people that you meet on the streets are they're oftentimes associated with being lazy, unproductive. And it's like it carries the wealth or lack thereof carries with it the sort of moral connotation
Yeah.
for either being a good person or a bad person.
Yeah, and I think that when you really talk to a lot of people who make this distinction in terms of like the benefits of capitalism versus the benefits of communism or Marxism of various kinds, what you get a lot of times is this real moral valuation about you can kind of, do you see in the wealthier members of society kind of the job creators, the people who are the productive members of society who have worked really hard and deserve everything that they have? Or do you see in them kind of the people who are there exploiting the poor? And I think that moral valuation is really hard to get your arms around if you don't go back and look at the foundations for these economic systems. Like, what is it that Marx is criticizing within the capitalist system? I mean, frankly, I think that you can separate out two different Marxes, right? So you have the Marx who is the economic philosopher, the Marx of Das Kapital, right, who is proposing a system of economics. And then you have the Marx as the critic of capitalism. And frankly, I think that the Marx as economist is not held in as much esteem, especially these days.
Yeah.
But Marx as critic of capitalism, especially since capitalism has now been globalized. It is the system, right? The all-encompassing system of the globalized world. I think that his critiques of capitalism, many of them are still very prescient.
Right. Yeah, all major nations today have capitalist economies. Even, I mean, the big battle of the 20th century we could talk about is this sort of ideological battle between communism and capitalism. But capitalism has carried the day. I mean, in terms of just practically speaking, capitalism's carried the day. Even communist countries, quote unquote, communist countries like China have adopted heavy capitalistic ideas. But so let's kind of dissect Marx then. So we could talk about. You want to start off talking about his critique of capitalism?
Marx is living in a time when capitalism is really just taking hold. And so, especially in terms of like industrial capitalism, the conditions of people working in factories in a place like Manchester, for example. And the early critics of capitalism, whether it's Ruskin or whether it's Marx or whether it's pick your leftist, right? It's that capitalism is largely dehumanizing in some way, that it turns people into machines. Before automation replaced people, it turned people into machines.
Yeah.
And the comparison that Marx uses is he compares the medieval artisan to the modern factory worker. So the medieval artisan, let's say you're a chair maker. In the medieval period, if you needed, say, a chair, then you had to go to a carpenter and you tell them, I need X number of chairs. Can you make them for me? And the carpenter took pride in what they did, and they made the chair from beginning to end, right? They took the wood, they crafted it a certain way, and so they could kind of see themselves reflected in the final product, right? And there's a kind of satisfaction to that. But the modern factory worker doesn't create anything from beginning to end. Instead, they stand on an assembly line and they make this little bit, and they do that all day long, which means a couple of things. One, you remove a specialized skill.
Yeah.
So people become interchangeable because anyone can pull a lever, anyone can do this one little thing. Whereas an artisan was someone that society valued for their skill. So already you have made people kind of interchangeable. Not only that, but the person who would have been an artisan now is involved in this menial task, which gives their life no value whatsoever. And if you spend your life, whether it's in a modern setting, working 9 to 5 days a week, or during Marx's day, you worked essentially until the boss let you go. There weren't restrictions on how much they could force you to work, really.
Yeah.
And so this means that people are slaving away at a job which provides them no security and provides them no kind of value. They feel, in Marxist terms, alienated from their work. And work is a central component for Marx.
Yeah.
Let me interject here too, because I think that there are three phrases that come up a lot when you talk about what you're getting at, Jared, and it's so Marx. I'm just going to add these in because I think that they can be helpful. Marx believed that under capitalism, the only thing that the worker could own was their capacity to work.
Yeah.
And that the quote unquote means of production and the market of exchange, which used to be owned by an artisan, right? Like you were saying, that an artisan would build a chair by taking the wood, shaping it, putting it together, designing it, and then would set the market of exchange, would set the value for his skill set and say, this is how much you have to pay me for this, time and labor. So they owned every aspect of it. And when you get plugged into the industrialized machine, all you own is your capacity to work. You no longer have, like at least in most cases, that was the argument. I mean, go ahead. Sorry, I just thought that was
No, it's good. You're selling your labor, right?
Yeah.
And so
this is what hourly wages are.
Yeah.
Right. I give you my hour of my life for X amount of money.
Yeah. And so Marx wasn't the first person to do this, but Marx is one of the more famous people, which is to compare this to chattel slavery. So to say that there's not much distinction between being a chattel slave and being a wage slave. Now, this is a critique that he makes. I mean, there's something additionally dehumanizing, obviously, about owning.
Slavery is way worse.
Yeah, there's something.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that he would recognize there's something very pernicious about the very idea of owning another person. But what he says is, if you look at the economics of it, what you're doing is not much different. So let me explain what his critique is. So let's say if you are a slave owner, then you purchase a person, but that person is an investment, right? Not that you care about the person, but you care about your investment. So you have to keep the person somewhat healthy. You have to put shelter over their head. You have to put food in their bellies. You have to keep them clothed, and just to protect your investment, not because you care about them. So that means that there's some cost involved in your investment. Now, he compares this to the capitalist, right? So if a capitalist, the person who owns the means of production, is paying their employees a starvation wage, right? Just enough for that worker to buy the essentials of life, keep shelter over their head, keep food in their belly, and keep clothes on their back. You don't pay them enough where they can build up capital of their own and maybe find a different job. There's no job security there, right? You can't leave because you don't know where else you go. The economics of it, he thinks, is pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
The conditions of the slave and the conditions of the worker both hinge on exploitation.
Right.
Not that, they're exactly the same thing, but in both cases, what you're doing is exploiting someone's labor for your profit. And he thinks that that's morally reprehensible.
And to that point, and then I want to get back to the points you were trying to bring up, Raymond. To that point, if you look within American history, and if you look at industrialization in America, one of the reasons for now, I mean, slavery in America is a huge moral issue at the time. There's a big debate about it at the time. But one of the reasons why slavery in the North starts to fade out is because the North starts to industrialize. It's
Yeah.
cheaper to hire workers than it is to buy slaves. That sounds really crude, but economically, I mean, this is what's speaking to Jared's point. You have to remember that there's no workers' rights. There's no job security. The guy that hired you at 8 a.m. in the morning can fire you at 9 a.m. and it doesn't matter because there's no laws, rules, or regulations concerning what an employer must do for his or her employees. So the labor, the parallel there between the worker and the slave is that both are easily expendable because
Yeah.
it's low skill, low pay work. Anyway, Raymond.
In a real,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that in a really perverse way, if you go back and look, some slave owners even defended slavery by comparing it to the working conditions of people in the North. Just say, well,
Right.
because, I mean, I don't want to get off on a tangent about the history of slavery, but there's been this paternalistic justification for slavery throughout the American antebellum South, wherein slaves were treated as if they were children, right, who could not think for themselves, and the benevolent slave owner is there to
Yeah.
guide and protect the slaves. And so part of the argument for some of the slave owners was to say, well, look, we take care of our slaves, right? We keep them in houses. I mean, it was obviously like horseshit, but still.
Yeah.
I mean, the comparison to the North was simply to say that, look, they're exploiting their laborers as well, but they don't care about them, right? They don't put them up in houses. They don't, provide them medicine when
Right.
they need it. In that case, both parties are wrong, the capitalist and the slave owner, but still,
Right.
you can see the logic of the argument.
Yeah. So Raymond, you were saying about Marx. You said that the first thing, throwing out a couple of terms that the workers own their capacity to work, and then I think you're going to bring up a couple of more points.
Yeah, so that is essentially, I think, what Marx is arguing is that the issue with capitalism is that the only thing that you own then as a worker is your capacity to work. You don't actually own the means of production. You don't own the stakes of an economic market exchange anymore. And so you become a cog in a large machine, and you don't have the same quote unquote input to design or implement your vision or the spirit of your work, so to speak, if you want to get in touch with sort of the Hegelianism of all of this. And that's just, and I think those are important factors to note, because apart from Das Kapital and his other works that Marx is perhaps even, like you were saying, Jared, a little bit more celebrated for, he's not really proposing what should be done economically
Yeah.
when he's critiquing capitalism. He's theorizing about how societies develops and about how processes of history sort of unfold. And as such, he's almost more celebrated for being one of the first to discuss what has been termed as historical materialism, which is the idea that society develops in conjunction with the results of the means of production, and so that the ordering features of these economic forces directly relate to the ordering features of society, and so forth and so on. So as you begin to see shifts in the economy and the economic forces, you begin to see shifts in society. They sort of mutually reinforce each other, and you can understand the forces of, say, something like feudalism by looking not only at the economy there, but by looking at the social structures and the political structures that are used to enforce the economy, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So, insofar as that is true, then what he is arguing is in many cases more robust than just an economic critique of capitalism, but it is really a cultural and social critique of capitalism, one that suggests that there's something almost, perhaps you could, I think you could fairly go so far as saying almost inhumane in capitalism
Yeah,
from Marx's perspective.
I would definitely say that. So if you read the Communist Manifesto, for example, like he dismisses what he calls utopian socialism and sentimentalism and all this stuff, but his actual language is just soaked with moralism, right? Like he sees capitalism not just as an inefficient system; he sees it as immoral. The way that the structures are in place is just immoral. It's about exploitation.
Yeah. So let me raise a question.
Yeah.
And either one of y'all can feel free to jump in here. So we've been talking this whole time about Marx. We've been talking about capitalism, Marxism, that sort of thing. So because let me preface this with, I've probably watched a solid like 30 hours worth of Žižek videos over the past week or so. Like when I go to sleep, I hear his voice in my head talking about stuff. But one of the questions I have, and also I need to say that I have read none of his books, and y'all are all probably well more informed. But I've heard him say he's a Marxist, but I really haven't heard him use any Marxist ideas, if that makes sense. He talked a lot about Hegel, and we could talk about the link there between Hegel and Marx, but I really haven't heard him use Marxist concepts in his thinking. So explain that to me.
Well, okay, again, this is my limited reading of him. I mean, I'm sure there are people who know his work much better than I do. But in my understanding, I don't think he's an orthodox Marxist in the sense that he's an ideologue pushing for something like what you would see in Das Kapital. Instead, I think, or at least my impression of him, is that what he's drawing from Marx is much more of the critical aspect, right? So he is a critic of capitalism, both the economic system and, more importantly, capitalism as a cultural system. And insofar as that's the case, I feel like his Marxism is much more in line with something like that you would get with critical theory, right? It's looking at how living in a capitalist society affects human relations and then drawing out all the inconsistencies and problems with it. Now, he's smart enough to realize that a communist system just introduces a whole different set of human problems, right? In this regard, as I think I mentioned last time, he seems less, again, an orthodox Marxist in this regard, that he is much more interested in critiquing ideologies, even Marxist ideologies, even if he identifies himself as in some way a Marxist. And so that's where I think that he falls in all of this vis-a-vis Marx. I think that what he's drawing out from Marx really is this high-level critique of what capitalism does to a society. And recently he's started talking about how he thinks the future. Now, he doesn't see this as a good thing, right? He just thinks that this is the inevitability. He thinks that what we're going to see is a move towards authoritarian capitalism, on par with certain socialist elements. So he thinks the future looks much more like communist capitalist China than the United States has. So he sees liberal democracies as kind of going away, and the sort of authoritarian capitalism with a social structure, something like what you see in Russia or especially China, is much more likely to be the future. He doesn't see that as a good thing. He just thinks it's an inevitability.
He also, I think, obviously he's associated with Marxism also in two different ways. One, because he just comes from that sort of philosophical genealogy, being Hegelian, being, connected with the Frankfurt School and all that stuff. And then on the other side of it, he's really interested in the idea of cultural revolution and how it happens, like the quote unquote event, which is an extremely simple concept and at the same time one of the most ambiguous ideas that you could ever hear people like Žižek, and other really sort of like off in their sort of own little world, Lacanian psychoanalysis thinkers. Like, when is the event of like the revolution, and when does something like that happen? How does it come about? In fact, when Trump was getting elected in the office, he's famously, seen on YouTube all over the place talking about how that could potentially lead to a genuine cultural revolution. Not because Trump is in any way like this great, leader, but for the exact opposite, that he thinks that everything has to sort of go through this, like event of being torn down and destroyed for you to have a genuine, in this case, like Marxist style cultural revolution occur.
Yeah, that's a genuinely Marxist idea. So
Yeah.
I think that at this point, we should probably make a distinction between socialism and Marxism, and I think this is a good place to make it.
Yeah.
So, in the broadest possible terms, right? The most general way that we can talk about socialism is to say that the distinction between socialism and capitalism has to do with the ownership of the means of production. So, in a capitalist society, you have private ownership of the means of production. That means you control the labor force, you control like mercantile capitalism or industrial capitalism, you would own the factory, you would own the items within the factory, and then you would pay the laborers. And then however much they produce in surplus to your cost, that money, that surplus value returns back to the capitalist.
Right.
In a socialist economy, you have shared ownership of the means of production, which means that the workers who work in the factory also own the factory. And if there's any surplus value, all of that additional capital doesn't go back to the private hands of the individual owners. It's dispersed evenly amongst the people who own it collectively. So that means that wealth is distributed more evenly. And so you don't have a few people getting very wealthy. You have a lot of people doing okay. Now, we obviously don't live in a society where the means of production are controlled collectively. We live in a very capitalist society where concentrations of wealth and power reside within the hands of a few. Now, how do you transition towards a socialist society? This is where you get different flavors of socialism. So if you have like a democratic socialism, a progressive socialism, then you say, well, we need to elect people who will move the economy slowly towards this by consensus, right? We have to convince everyone that socialism is the best possible economic system, and then we can vote in people who will create socialist type systems. Marxism is different. Marx did not think that the wealthy would ever just voluntarily give up or allow socialism to be enacted, because that would fundamentally displace their power and authority in society. So the only way that you could have a socialist society would be for everyone to have a socialist society. And the only way that you would get everyone to have socialist society is through global revolution, right? Where the proletariat, the working class, rise up and overtake the bourgeoisie, who control everything, and only then can you enact socialism. So Marxism is a revolutionary kind of socialism. And that's different than a lot of other different approaches to socialism.
So would you say that Žižek sort of embraces the revolutionary aspect of Marxism?
Absolutely.
I think so.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think he believes it can happen at any other point, and I think that I think he honestly thinks it's a good thing. I don't know, or he at least sees it as the only way to accomplish it.
Well, and if you look at something like, if you take Lenin, for example, so Marx theorized that this sort of revolution would begin only in an advanced industrialized society with a high level of education, right? This would be kind of an enlightened view of the proletariat who would rise up together collectively and, throw off their chains. Lenin saw in the peasant class in Russia a revolutionary potential. And so his approach is something called vanguardism. So Marx utilized a term which he never explained, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat. So Marx thought that it may be necessary to have a revolutionary action and then kind of a holding pattern until other, revolutionary dominoes ticked off, right? So maybe you had the working class in one country foment a revolution, centralize authority, and then kind of hold authority until other revolutions happened. And then Marx was convinced that this would just be a domino effect. And then you could start restructuring society. Well, Lenin bought into this idea. And this is what you see in something like the October Revolution, right? The idea that in Russia you would throw off the power of the czar, and you would centralize authority quickly, and you would hold that authority until other revolutions happen, and then you could restructure society along socialist means. What happened with Leninism, though, is those other revolutions never came. And
It was a bait and switch.
Yeah, it was a bait and switch. And the thing is, we know that this was kind of always his intention, because within weeks of taking power, they shut down the workers, the Soviet worker groups, right? The things which were the genuinely Marxist element within Russian society. They closed those down, they centralized authority, and then they never gave it up. So then what you basically had was state dictatorship, right? This is why Marxists, like Orthodox Marxists, get really testy whenever people utilize examples like Venezuela or Cuba or Russia or China and talk about them as failed communist states. The Marxists would say, well, there's never been a communist state, because a state is kind of antithetical to communism, really. And so yeah, you have self-proclaimed Marxist and communist within the People's Republic of China. But for Orthodox Marxists, they would see that as an aberration of some kind.
So let me.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Raymond.
I was going to say, I'll add to this conversation, since we're talking about Zizek's, commitment to Marxism and cultural revolution. I think that historically there is evidence on the side of the cultural Marxist theory that eventually most stable societies polarize in some way, usually based on economic forces, because they mirror the sustainability of the, like this single family household, right? Of the single nuclear family. And as a result, most of the time, this leads to horrific, bloody revolutions. And I think that there's a fair chance that that's exactly what will happen the next time that a cultural revolution of the kind that Marx is proposing will happen. It's not just that they're going to go up and get all the rich people and say you can't have your money anymore. It's that they're going to French Revolution that bitch and go up and kill them all and take the money. It's that kind of thing. That's what'll happen.
Let the heads roll.
Basically, yeah.
Here's the socialist critique of communism, which is to say that the problem with communism is that most revolutions don't actually eventuate in a better society.
Yes.
Most revolutions eventuate in authoritarian dictatorships. And the other critique is, in a weird way, in a really strange way, this sort of revolutionary mentality leads to a political quietism.
Yeah.
That means a kind of political inaction, because the Marxist revolutionaries think that social change can only ever come through a revolution. So that means that they choose to not participate actively in trying to fix the social order, because they think that things have to get they have to get worse before they can get better. And that's the reason why you see even Žižek did this, which is to say, like, oh, Donald Trump is a much better choice than Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton is going to kind of preserve this false liberal democracy that we have, where Trump is going to increase this polarization, and then maybe some sort of real change will happen as a result. Whereas, kind of democratic socialists would say, no, you can only ever do this incrementally, and this represents a large step backwards. The Marxists, in a strange way, would say, no, it's much better for us to take a deep dive so that we can fix everything after the fact.
So let me.
And on that point, democratic socialism, which would be something along the lines of what we're seeing with progressive movements in America right now, like Bernie, Elizabeth Warren, those kinds of politicians. That is a much more peaceful transformation of a system, long overdue, than the
Well,
Gotcha.
Marxists.
I would add a caveat that Elizabeth Warren is not someone that declares herself a
No, she
socialist.
doesn't. But I mean, let's just put it this way: America is a democratic socialist country, plain and simple. We have highways, we have roads. Yeah, since FDR.
Since
But it is.
FDR.
It is now. That's what I'm saying. You have a fire department. You have police. You have healthcare that you can just walk into a hospital and be cared for. We have public schools. Utilities are public. I mean, the list is endless of the amount of social institutions that we have. We're a social democratic.
Medicaid, Medicare.
Yeah, Medicare, social welfare, whatever it is. There's at least 24 major institutions, and we're social democrats. We just don't want to admit to it, and we constantly undercut that aspect of our society.
Say, I would just say that I disagree with that. I don't think we're democratic or socialist.
We're social
not that
republic.
We should, not that we should. No, not that we shouldn't be.
Before we
but
get off
I just
on
don't think that we actually are.
before we get
That was
off
a
on
tangent.
political tangents here, so
Yeah, let's not do that.
let me sum up. So if we're talking about Žižek's Marxism, right? So the two big points I took away from all of that was, first of all, he is a critic of capitalism.
Yes.
And second of all, we talked about his belief in the sort of cultural revolution.
Yeah.
So that being said, how do you think Žižek's Marxism will play off of Peterson's capitalism? Because we said last time that the real reason why they're having this debate is because Peterson is going to be the champion of capitalism, Žižek's going to be the champion of Marxism/communism, and they're going to butt heads. So where do you see Žižek's Marxism coming into play in his critique of, or maybe oddly enough, agreement with Peterson? Because they do agree on a lot.
Well,
maybe not a lot, but some.
I think that again, because Žižek is much more interested in the critique of capitalism than he is with orthodox Marxism as an ideology, I think that he is going to grant to Peterson that capitalism has been a success story, and insofar as capitalist economies have lifted a majority of the world's population out of extreme poverty.
That's
so
impossible
I think that he's
to deny, right?
Yeah, I think that he's going to grant that, and then I think that he's going to say that the future looks something like that. Our future is a capitalist future, and that the concern is that it's going to be an authoritarian capitalist future. And if I had to guess, I would say that he's going to bring to bear some historical critiques of capitalism from a communist perspective, right? To say, just because it's been successful in these regards doesn't mean that it's not a dehumanizing exploitative system, which is rife with all sorts of moral problems. And so I feel like that's where he's going to situate himself, is to say, if your argument is that communism is going to lead to Stalin, that's a non-starter because you don't understand what communism is. If your argument is that capitalism is preferable because it leads, people out of poverty, I'll grant that to you. But if your argument is that capitalism is a better moral system, then that's a no-go.
Yeah, and I hope Peterson doesn't go the route of saying that socialism, or at least Marxism, always leads to Stalinism and
That's
Leninism.
exactly where he's going to go.
It'll just
if he does not connect communism to Stalin and Pol Pot and the Chinese Revolution, then
if he does that, the only response Žižek is going to have then is that Jordan Peterson is naive and stupid, and then that's just going to be super boring from there on out.
Again, that critique is so it misunderstands so much. And again, it's not to say that there's anything good or redeemable whatsoever in a figure like Stalin. But it's just to say
There's
that if
not.
your critique is that capitalism leads to Stalin, then you don't understand what you're talking about.
I'm curious to know, because again, I've read none of Žižek's works, but I did read in graduate school. We had to read Francis Fukuyama's *The End of History*, which sounds really similar to Žižek, in that one of the things that Fukuyama he talks about the history of the 20th century, how the 20th century you have these two competing economic theories, capitalism, Marxism, or communism, I should say, not Marxism, that capitalism ultimately wins. But one of the things that Fukuyama warns about is that capitalism isn't necessarily tied with democracy. That it has been in the 20th century, democratic nations have been capitalistic, but that capitalism isn't necessarily linked with it. So you could get, for example, an authoritarian capitalist society, or a capitalist society that is like a religious monarchy, for example. I don't know how any of that relates, but
I think it relates insofar as, Fukuyama is someone that, Žižek has critiqued, which is to say that if his assumption was that the future was one of liberal democracies, then if anything, the last couple of years have made a mockery of that notion, right? That maybe
mhm,
capitalism wins, but it's not going to be liberal democracies. If anything, it's going to be an authoritarian, an authoritarian form of capitalism.
mm,
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah,
mm.
yeah.
So you see this. I don't know if we have enough time to talk about Hegel, but I think Hegel will probably play an important part in Zizek's discourse. It usually does, but
Yeah, but I don't know what Peterson's going to say in return because I'm certain that Peterson has never read Hegel.
yeah, I mean, to Peterson's credit, I don't think that most people should read Hegel.
It's not in his
Most
wheelhouse.
people read
I understand. I understand that it's not within his field, but at the same time, I feel like Zizek's going to say a lot about Hegel, and Peterson's not going to have much to say because, again, I see no indication that he's
Well, he's not a
ever read Hegel.
philosopher. Yeah.
Not even that he should have. Again, not even that he should have. It's just they're going to talk
What
past
time
each
are
other
we
at
at?
that
Do we have
point.
time to talk about Hegel? Break it down real quick.
We're at 53 minutes according to my clock, so we've got just a couple of minutes if you want to say something
Super
about
brief,
Hegel,
Raymond.
right?
I'll throw in just some brief stuff, just because I don't know. I don't know. Peterson's smart enough to read Hegel. I don't know if he'll take the time to, because it's just a whole ball game to play with yourself to read somebody like Hegel. But Hegel is, in the same way that Thomas Hobbes is instrumental in what most people consider, the first jumping point of starting to talk about the social relationships between human beings that make up, different societal pictures like democracy, monarchy, and stuff like that. Hegel is in many ways the same when it comes to understanding the dialectic between an individual and other people with reference to work. He has a famous example of the lordship and the question of bondage, the bondsman and the laborer in his Phenomenology of Spirit. And it's an extension of this idea that self-consciousness exists in and for itself only when it exists for another, and that insofar as we are in relations to other people, we become, conscious of us, or conscious of us as self, conscious of yourself as a self. So it's very dialectical, and it's very sort of like confusing, and has a lot of repetitive language, like, in and for itself, when and by the fact it exists for another, that kind of stuff, those kinds of phrases. It's pretty annoying sometimes. But anyways, the idea is that basically I think it would benefit both of them to talk about that, to hash it out, because I think capitalism has its roots in this kind of thought process that Hegelianism is proponing, which is this question about self-consciousness and the question about self-interest, right? And insofar as the Wealth of Nations is a tome about your self-interest having value to other people, then in the same way, the Hegelianism that sort of underlines Marxism is this idea that you derive meaning for yourself insofar as you exist in relation to other people. So there are kinds of two ways of talking about your relation to other people and putting, emphasis and value on different points of that relationship. And I think that it'd be meaningful if, they talked about it, but I don't know if that'll be something that comes up. It's probably not going to be a people pleaser because it's pretty specialized discourse. So
Yeah, it's pretty dense.
Well, I mean, I think that we can say this generally, like that most of our terms by which we self-identify are relational in character. So if you see yourself, I mean, we can do this without a lot of politically laden language. If you see yourself as tall, it's a relational term. Tall in relation to what, right? And the only way that you're tall is because there are other people who are shorter than you, right? This key feature of your own psyche is dependent upon someone else. So Hegel uses this in terms of the master-slave dichotomy, right? So the person who is the master, right, who identifies themselves as the master, requires the slave, right, is dependent upon the slave for their own self-identification. You could even say this in relation to a lot of political dynamics. So a lot of people see themselves not so much as being this positive affirmation of these are the qualities which are important to me politically, so much as it is I don't like the other side. And so it's the easiest way to define oneself is in relation to another, to say I don't know what I am, but I'm not that, whatever that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a the difference in language is just simple, like, self-consciousness versus self-interest, right? I mean, I measure myself against other people either in terms of being conscious of who I am in relation to them, like in relationship to my siblings, in relationship to my parents, in relationship to my friends. I measure my consciousness as, being in those relationships, or I measure it in terms of my interest. Being in relation to them puts me in a certain mode of self-interest to preserve relations or to preserve existence, stuff like that. So it really is two lines of a sort of a historical trajectory coming out of Hobbes and Hegel. Capitalism being, Hobbesian, and Adam Smith, and Hegelianism and Marxism being tied. It's just from the very start, their moral presuppositions are very different. I think that should be enough. We can end it there.
Sounds good.
On Hegel, at least.
Well, one last closing thing. I think that you can see this moral critique in terms of what a lot of socialists would say about capitalism is in the capitalist system, you have this notion of success, and everyone wants to be successful. Well, if everything is irreducibly relational, then that means that to be successful, you have to better yourself in relation to others. So it requires this sort of disparity between the rich and the poor. You want to be rich, and that requires there to always be poor. Whereas the communists sees themselves as everyone is kind of irreducibly involved in this process that we're all collectively moving towards something. So it's not so much a requirement that you have this disparity between rich and poor, because we're all kind of working towards this shared goal. And so there's something egalitarian there. And so I think that if you see the only way that you can see success is in relation to other people, that you are trying to beat out other people, then egalitarianism of any stripe is kind of a non-starter. And you resist it at a moral level. You don't want people to be the same, because how would you know that you've attained
The only
anything?
thing I would really say about Hegel, wait, can I add something about Hegel? The only thing I would say about Hegel is only read Hegel if you hate yourself and you're into self-punishment, because that shit is boring.
I think that's the place to stop.
That's the place to stop.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for our post Žižek Peterson debate, where we talk about what they actually ended up talking about. Until then,
Peace.
have a good one.
Bye.